Hello, and welcome to the Educational Forum presented by the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover and the American College of History and Legal Studies in Salem, New Hampshire. My name is Kurt Olson, and I'm a professor at the Massachusetts School of Law. Today's program is First Voices Indigenous Radio. Tiokasin Ghosthorse, a member of the Lakota tribe from South Dakota, hosts a weekly radio program in New York City called First Voices Indigenous Radio. I first met him in Plymouth, Massachusetts during last year's National Day of Mourning, also known to Euro-Americans as Thanksgiving Day. Tiokasin spoke briefly from a trailer on Coles Hill that day. He spoke about Native Americans' connection to the struggles of Indigenous people everywhere, and he ended his presentation with a fist pump and a rousing hoka hey. I was immediately struck by Tiokasin's nobility of spirit and imposing presence. Meeting Tiokasin brought to mind the Indians who occupied Wounded Knee in 1973 during the anniversary of the massacre there in the 1890s. These Indians, part of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, fought for rights for Indians and sought to reinvigorate the movement to restore the traditional culture of language, music, religion, and spirituality, which had been ripped from Indian tribes everywhere as part of the white man's efforts to deny Indians their birthright. During today's program, Tiokasin and I seek to inform our audience about Native American issues and how those issues affect Indigenous peoples everywhere. Welcome, Tiokasin. Hoka hey.
Hoka hey. Thank you very much, Kurt, for inviting me to this program, Educational Forum.
Educational Forum, correct.
And
yep.
I just want to say, to all the listeners out there, you may hear something that you disagree with, but, sometimes it has to be that way. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but also hoka hey means let's have some action.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it really means. Let's get going.
Right. So you're actually trying to motivate people to do something. And I guess that sort of leads into the first question that's a part of my introduction. You're a radio host of a radio program in New York City, and yet you hail from South Dakota originally. Can you tell me something about the process, what brought you there?
Well, the process is a long process, of course, but it began when I was a childhood. I won't go through that, but I'll go through where I used to work with the state legislature of Washington in the data information services there for the state senate and the House chambers and whatnot. And being a computer programmer and just basically following orders to get data out so somebody else could speak about it. It left me as a Native person wondering why my voice, or as an Indigenous person, Native American, was not being heard. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I have to go back and try to get a voice for these people, go back to school actually. And so I did. I stopped going to work.
Okay.
And I protested in a way that most people weren't. They had their security, their financial security and whatnot, and that was their security. I walked off the job because I could not handle not being me anymore. Mm-hmm. I'm not an order taker.
Right.
And first of all, so I had to go, and I said, I'm going back to school to relearn about things that I knew about. I had to have a piece of paper to understand, to say that I knew about being a Native person, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So I went back to get the piece of paper.
Now, I understand from conversations that we've had that you also you were, I guess, ripped out of your own background. Yes. In terms of you were on the reservation, I assume, when you were a young child, and you were taken away to a boarding school, and that's fairly typical of people of your generation, correct?
It's typical. Most people thought this happened in the early first half of the 19th century, right? Or excuse me, 1900s. Mm-hmm. And it happened up until in 1988 and continues in more of a legal way with the Indian Child Welfare Act, where a lot of Native children are adopted, fostered out, or just plain taken away from the parents because of the economic plight of most Native people in the West, where I'm from, in South Dakota. Whereas we are non-casino tribes in a sense that we are held under the stigma that we are rich as Native people because Native people have tribes, have casinos, but we as one are the poorest people in the Western Hemisphere behind the people of Haiti only. And as a young child, part of the government policy was to take the children away to teach them, acculturate them into another society of America. Basically the motto was, and still stands somewhat in my mind, that to kill the Indian and save the man is the policy, so that we don't retain culture, we don't speak our language, we don't think differently than what Americans are taught, mainly by their educational methods And also a disconnection to the land. I think that's the main theme about why natives become American is that we will leave the land so the rest of America can be had as private property.
Right. I know that I think it was Red Cloud, who was a chief, I'm not sure of your tribe or not, but Red Cloud who said that the white man has made us many promises and only one has he kept, and that is he promised that he would take our land, and he took our land. I mean, and that continued. I mean, that was part of the reason for the American Indian movement gaining strength in the 70s, right? Was because even though they had said, okay, this is your reservation, this is where you can stay, they recognized there are a lot of minerals and various other valuable things on the land. So we're going to take more. I mean,
in that time of the 50s and 60s when the multinational, in that case international, extraction corporations were coming onto land and doing exploratory drilling holes, and they discovered uranium and oil and gold and coal and all the precious minerals and reserves of energy that are on that America's worst lands that we were driven to or relocated to. Well, it was more than just that. It was of course, we attacked the culture first. We tell the kids that it's not good to be a native or an Indian. So that's drilled into the people. Then we become welfare state people, that we look to the handouts of America and the good people of America to help us along. And then we lose face because we weren't beggars in the first place or thieves. It goes against our philosophies of life to be that. We always shared. We were fiercely self-sufficient as people. We didn't have concepts, of course, but so I think what happened with the U.S. government is to come and take that land away from Native people, but not give the rest of America the true knowledge of why they were doing those forced relocations because of the land.
Right. Okay. Well, not so much the land really as what was under the land.
Yes.
Right. And I think you mentioned earlier or within that last answer something about the worst lands of America. Well, to the average white person, I guess, or as I've described them, Euro-American, they might look at the Black Hills of South Dakota and see nothing but wasteland, or see a reservation where there are poor people, as you said, the welfare state, right? Whereas you view that as sacred land, right? And part of the reason for your outrage at the United States government coming in and wanting to take more of it is that those are your holy places. Is that right?
Yeah, the whole earth is holy to us as Native people. And in the 60s, again, if you add the fact that we had no religion or freedom of religion, we could not vote. Any resources that we had were inadequate. And so it was either a blessing in disguise that some of us did retain culture as Lakota people, to not have running water or to have any services that the rest of this country did have. I think most of us at that time were choosing not to because we see and we have seen what it's done to the soul or spirit of the land and the people. As we understood that we have a term for the type of behavior that described as greed is called washichu. Washichu meaning, and it could be anybody, not just a certain race, but it means it takes too much or takes the fat. So we wanted to avoid that. Even today there are people not wanting to be an American because when I go home I'm teaching about the etymology of what these words like ame, rica mean in Latin form and Romance feminine form. Ame means the love of, rica means riches. And when you become an American you become one who loves riches. So it's very dichotomous to native, which is non-material, as to material. So you have these two philosophies in clash, in a sense.
Right, and that resulted in, again, I guess the second massacre at Wounded Knee, essentially, when, the first massacre would have been in the 1890s when women and children were killed by the American cavalry because the men had gone away to still continue to fight. How did the Indians at that point, Native Americans, bring it forward in 1973? In other words, how did Hokahe take strength from what happened in 1973?
I think having enough suppression, all the shuns like depression and all of those. American Indian movement, as far as I know the history of it, was started in the urban cities of Minneapolis, where a lot of Native men, women, and children were being found on the streets and being beat up. And although there was a black movement going on, the Native person was left out of the picture, you know. And so the government, using the policy of out of sight, out of mind, basically applied that to Native people and did not bring into light for the rest of America, who really believed, as the rest of the world believed at the time, that all the Native people were killed off. So there was really no Native people left. You didn't live in teepees, so there's no more Indians.
Right.
But yet that remained strong, and especially that north central part of this country. And so they came out of the cities and the barrios and the ghettos and saying that we can't be treated like this anymore. It's our turn to stand up. And so that's when they gathered. They had Western educated Native people like myself, but also people who were trying to go back and find their heritage and culture. And then there was those of us on the reservation who had our culture and language, who joined forces with the educated people, and then out of that came the new Native type, a Native person who was, you know, a prototype basically, who could include Western reasoning and educational processes along with the old way of doing things as Native people, and combine that, and that's where the American Indian movement came out.
There's so much I want to talk about. Can we make this a 3-hour show? No. Before we get to the second hour, though, something that my 12-year-old daughter asked me when I described some of these issues, it was, how is it that, you know, I think you talked about, you know, the theft of your land. You talked about how you were indoctrinated and your language was taken away from you, and your religion and your spirituality and all of those things were taken away from the white man's culture. What her response was, well, how can that happen? What about the Constitution? I mean, how is it that, I mean, obviously we're in a law school setting here, so the Constitution is important. Why is it, do you think, that the Constitution doesn't apply to Native Americans?
I think because originally the truth is that the Constitution does come from the Iroquois Confederacy. It does come, and the U.S. Congress acknowledged that not long ago, that it does indeed influenced by and you find out Franklin and Jefferson did go and spend at least 30 years before and learned the Mohawk jargon, the Mohegan jargon, all the Iroquois jargon of trade, and learned and sat with their councils and studied, and like, wow, these people had equality, men and women. And they said, how could, and at that time there were a few million. It wasn't just 100,000 or so. There were millions of Native people across this land that lived the same way, the same principles. So it was not just the Iroquois, but the Constitution was in this part in Philadelphia in the Northeast. So, so that's where they talk about. In fact, Jake Swamp and Tom Porter, who are traditional chiefs this day of the Iroquois Confederacy, have those stories that are not written into history books. They may be referenced, but when the Iroquois chiefs were asked to come to the Freedom Hall, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, they were put upstairs. And whenever the Continental Congress had deliberations, they would go upstairs and ask the Native people, what did you do when you got to this part? And the thing that we don't hear is that these chiefs were locked into the upstairs. They were only brought food and questions. And we don't hear the other part of, you know, how the founding fathers actually excluded the Native people. Well, that's a mindset, because this country needed an enemy. And the women and children, well, they were property of the rich white males, and they couldn't vote. And the black man was property also, so they couldn't vote. Women belonged, poor white people belonged as serfs or serfdom in that thinking of it, and they were property. They couldn't vote. They didn't have power. But then you had millions upon millions of Native people. Let's not let them vote. Let's not let them vote, because that means there's going to be power here. So from that time, we were mentioned as far as being governed by commerce, and that the United States did have say in what they traded with other countries and whatnot. And that's in the Constitution. And with the Indian tribes, right. Yeah. And so they mentioned Indian nations within, and that was about it. And today that's still true, but as far as giving us freedom of religion, communal property, which we were used to sharing, that did not fit privatization and ownership, and monarchy especially, because as you see, this country still adores the King and Queen of England, yet it's a country that's not supposed to be upon those principles where everybody is inalienable and is treated equally. Well, it's not true with Native peoples even today. When you are an evidence, living evidence of that Constitution and the crimes committed against Native people such as myself, and knowing that, and being able to understand the inequalities, Well, that's not going to be listened to because that's the enemy talking to them. So for your 12-year-old, I say, look at what you're reaping as an American. And you really think in as ownership terms, you think about all Americans, any American, foreigners who come here want a piece of the American pie. Metaphorically, I say, if you want a piece of the American pie, just don't forget who owns the bakery.
In terms of who owns the bakery and how these stories are told going forward, one of the things I studied in college was Greek and Latin languages, and this whole notion of the oral tradition. And I know that the oral tradition is, you've already mentioned the Iroquois chiefs, right, who maintain the stories about how we got a lot of the Constitution from the Iroquois Confederacy. How does that oral tradition work even now, and could you describe something about how those stories come down to us through time?
It doesn't work very well nowadays because in a sense, they're in my nation, the Lakota, the Sioux. There is an old language, old Lakota, and then there's a new Lakota. The new Lakota tends to objectify a lot more. In other words, there's an ownership or possession of things. So that breaks down a relational sense of being with the younger children. They see what they want on TV, and that's what they're going to get. Instead of sharing what they see on TV, that belongs to them in individuality. So when you break down, originally the I and me, that did not exist in Lakota, the words for it.
Right. I'm sorry, let me repeat that if you would. I and me, so the whole notion of possession or myself has no meaning for Lakota people, correct?
It does now,
right?
But back then, the I and me was just non-existent. We didn't have the word. The old Lakota. The new Lakota reference I and me first and foremost. So when we're speaking English, that's what we tend to do is I and me. And possessive in that sense.
Okay. So there are really two different branches of the Lakota language at this point, though the branch that has been, I guess, infected by various English concepts, and the one that still maintains the traditional heritage?
Yes, and I know this may offend some people, but there is some time in the 1800s when, because of our prophecies, and our prophecies are basically 2,500 years before we even had the inkling of what a white man was, in that sense, that we prophesied that these things would happen to us, and at that time we would have to bring out the sacred language. Now, a sacred language is meant that you and I, as native people, if that would be, we taught common, but when we saw the enemy coming, we had to have sort of a code between us to protect us. So when we were captured or whatnot, in that sense, that we would use this code language. Well, that was sort of a sacred thing to us. We had, as commoners, in a sense, had to use sacred language to protect our spirit, so that remains intact. And the irony of it is, Kurt, is that we use that seed, that heritage of being sacred as human beings, so that we can help the enemy who is trying to take from us. So in a sense, doing this this TV program, not radio, this TV program is that we are actually helping those who would see, because we know that we are people of earth, and that someday we would have to come together. And Crazy Horse said that when there will come a time when I look into your eyes and I see the center of the universe, and when you're at that place within you, I too will be at that place, and there will be peace between our peoples. That's paraphrasing what Crazy Horse said. Right. And that time is now because of what is happening to Earth, our mother. Yeah, right? And so in that way, we recognize beyond history, beyond labels and cultures and religions, that our energy as you and I, as beings, is the same. And that's the message that we're trying to pass along, because that spirit cannot be controlled by those same religions or politics or, economics or whatever. That cannot be. Because we all go to the same place when it's done, finished, right? Right. So. You
gave me a certain posture, a picture of yourself looking like this. Yes. And I think that's tied into what you just said about how actually Lakota, and you mentioned the term Sioux, which you seem to bristle at. You take a little bit of offense at the term
I
Sioux.
bristle at everything.
Okay,
yes,
good.
so-
That's what
so
I'm
yeah,
looking
no.
forward to. Let's hoke a hay. So why is it that there is that distinction between, on the one hand, the Lakota who are trying to reach out to their enemies and show them that we are all part of the same essential, I guess, force, right? And at the same time, there is this feeling that, well, you know, we don't like the term Sioux. That's a label that you on the outside have applied to us.
Yeah, yeah. Sioux is a derivative of a language of Nadewa Sioux, which recognized that it really meant Nadewa Sioux in an Ojibwa language, and as far as I know, meant the ones hard to find in the grass, because in the prairie they were tall grass, 6 foot tall grass, and then we were hard to find. And when you take part of that Nadewa Sioux, not Nadea off, there's Sioux, and that essentially meant enemy. And so when the French came down a river, they couldn't repeat what the Chippewa were saying, so Ojibwa, and
Right.
so that's where Chippewa comes from, by the way.
Okay.
Just like Cherokee comes from Chalagi.
Oh.
So because Jefferson could not say Chalagi, he said Cherokee.
Cherokee.
'Cause that's what he heard. But anyway, so when they came down the river, they could not say Nadewa Sioux, but they heard Sioux. So they start using it, and that's when the government said, oh, we're going to use Sioux because it means enemy, and we have to make them enemy, as I presented before. Millions of Native people, they can't vote, let's make them the enemy.
Right.
And so and Lakota merely means peaceful ones. People come together and make friends with everybody, all life, not just humans.
Okay. So even though you say that you bristle at everything, the truth is that you would reach out to your enemies and show them that there is a better way for us all to live together.
In a sense, yeah, this means what is above is also below. It's also signifying that we have, our thought process comes from our heart as this nasula that would be called brain in English. We don't have that concept of a brain, but it is the thought process which creates, and so we know that creation comes from a thought process. This merely means seed of the heart. Nasula means seed of the heart. So all of our process comes from the center, as all indigenous peoples around the world have, even your people in the original sense of being indigenous, come from that.
Actually, that probably would bring us back to the audience. You say that you may have offended people before by something you might have said, but as you've pointed out, indigenous peoples exist all over the world, and part of the reason for your radio show is to reach out to, whether it's I think you said Maori in New Zealand, or the indigenous peoples in Australia, but I think you also pointed out that in Europe there are many indigenous people, all of whom are threatened by extinction, correct?
Exactly. About 71 different European tribes, I guess you would say, in that sense, European peoples who are losing their language just as fast as anybody else in the world as indigenous. There are approximately 350 million indigenous peoples out of, almost 8 billion people. All of those peoples are indigenous, live on 71% of the land that's still pristine in the world, and that has clean water and clean air and clean land. While that is being taken away now with the onslaught of so-called civilizations and civilizations' higher thinking form, right? Evolved, but if it's to kill Earth, that's not higher thinking. So you have indigenous peoples who are living the highest form of intelligence by taking care of the land and not cutting it down to make books to read about what they cut down.
What they've recently cut down. Interestingly, I think that dichotomy that you mentioned before is key, and probably is one of the most important things that you could explain on the show today, and that is, the relational, as you explained, the Lakota way, as compared to the modern, I guess you'd call it, quote unquote, civilized way of thinking, right? Which is rational, and there must be an end point and a beginning point and all of those things, whereas yours is more of a circle. Is that a good way to describe it?
I say this without trying to be comparative, but because I'm speaking a language, I have to say, oh, this versus whatever.
Right.
So when I come and I speak Lakota, I'm looking at the whole picture, a circle with data comes from any place arbitrarily within that circle. That's my information base and data bank. And when I speak English, I'm basically speaking about a a rectangle on its one end to the other, top and the bottom, beginning and ending, and all the data is nice, neat rows, information, so you have to memorize it. Well, you can't fit a quantum physics thinking relational view into that rational, because that ration all, basically, I think, in my simplest terms. But you have that, and you can take the big circle and shrink it down and put it at the bottom of that little strip, but you still don't have the whole view because that little strip is under control. And being free means that you can, with the big circle, take the rational thinking process and put it within that circle and be inclusive, because the other one is exclusive. It talks about chosen people, elite, special. We can't have that in Lakota. When everything is equal to who and what you are. That's how you you look at life. That's how Einstein looked at it. E equals mc squared. Everything is relationship. And that's what it's about. And it seems very sort of childish in that rational way of thinking. Oh, that's some new agey stuff that really doesn't matter. But scientists really are now looking to that native science in a sense and trying to include it somehow. But now they have to reach outside, and I say reach outside of the box, which is an old cliche, but I also say we have to start thinking outside of the bomb.
I think you have recently visited with people at Columbia University School of Medicine to talk to them about exactly that kind of thing, that there are different ways of looking at medicine, different way of looking at healing. Are all of those things tied together? Is it holistic medicine that you're talking about, or is it something that that they needed to know?
The head of neurology, the brain surgeons, all these people are interested in this stuff because they realize maybe before they had some inkling of it, but I think now there's a whole world opening up where they realize that energy has to do with everything, and that cannot be controlled or can be understood. It's the mystery, but it's how you use the energy, because as humans on this side of the planet, we have tended not to use energy properly. We use too much of it. So it's depleting other parts of the world, like water is energy, like pollution is energy that's gone astray, right? We use it improperly, and that's what they're looking at to make things in a positive light, is to use energy in a proper way. That's simple.
Now, one of the interesting things that I've gotten from reading, doing a little background reading in preparation for this show, is something that Linda Hogan says in her book, and I think that you probably would agree with this, but obviously I don't want to put words in your mouth. When when European Americans visit a place like Lakota land in South Dakota or elsewhere, they become enchanted. And even though originally going there they think, well, this is all just child's play or whatever, and it's not really good thinking, they have a hard time leaving once they're there. Is that part of the reason why they realize, well, this is actually a better way of thinking?
Well, again, I'll go back to where we don't have the word for better, because that's on a degree of better or worse, right? Because it merely means that we're not satisfied when you have better or a new way. But if you learn how to live well, and if they run into a culture like Lakota culture with the pockets that still remain, you understand a philosophy that's really different. It's not better or worse, but it's different from the rote philosophy that we've been given, the material philosophy, what makes you successful and what makes you intelligent. Well, it's totally opposite. It's more of a spiritual, more an energy that they feel, and that in this society, that's missed because religion contains and controls it. So when you as a non-native would come to Lakota country, you tend not to understand through the head in those thought process, but more of an intuitive value that we all feel as children.
Excellent. We'll finish this up after the break. Thanks very much, Tiokasin.
Awesome.
At the New American College of History and Legal Study in Salem, New Hampshire, you can finish your bachelor's degree affordably and get on the fast track to law school. We teach American history, and you'll receive a rigorous education at a very low cost. The small day and evening classes allow you to interact closely with the distinguished faculty. At the American College of History and Legal Studies, professors don't lecture. Through the discussion method of teaching, you'll be engaged in the issues raised in class. You'll learn to be a critical thinker, a better writer, and a polished public speaker. And you'll be able to compete with anybody in today's competitive marketplace. You can also get on the fast track to law school. Qualified students gain early admission into the Massachusetts School of Law. The new American College of History and Legal Studies offers the junior and senior years of undergraduate education. To finish your bachelor's degree, with the opportunity to start your law degree early, call or visit today.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
Can you tell which of these children was not born free? Can you tell which of these children was not born equal? Can you tell which of these children does not deserve to be treated with dignity? We can't either. Human right number one. We are all born free and equal.
Welcome back to MSL's Educational Forum. Today we're discussing Indigenous Voices, the radio show broadcast from New York City on a weekly basis and also heard around the world at various affiliates. Tiokasin, before the break we were talking about how the thought processes differ depending on whether you're Euro-American or a Lakota. And you were talking about how children in our culture are infected in certain ways by the denial and various other things. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, you know, when you asked me earlier about the U.S. Constitution, and in my younger days when I was more forthright and more protesting things, you know, more like, you know, you're right and I'm wrong, without knowing much. Maybe I don't yet, but when people say, well, I wasn't there, I didn't kill your grandmother, I didn't do this, and you know, don't blame me for you not having what you should have like we do. So I thought upon that, and I said, wait, now you follow the U.S. Constitution, right? And he says, yeah, who doesn't? I'm a citizen. I follow the U.S. Constitution. And so I'm saying, well, that was in 1776, was it not? And they say, yes, it was. And I says, well, I wasn't there. I didn't sign the Constitution, so why should I follow your laws? And so that's the same reasoning I'm saying is if someone walks up to me and says, my Lakota flute is just like their recorder, I'll say, no, your recorder's just like my flute. To put it in their shoes, basically, right. Because then it brings it to playing a level, you know, like, look, we're the same. We may be different only in color, but we're the same. Right. So when you think of you as a better people or race or civilization, look how inferior that thinking is.
And leads eventually to destructiveness around the world, right? I mean, we've already talked about how indigenous cultures throughout Europe, I think you mentioned the number of indigenous cultures that I'm sure many people aren't aware of, but then around the world, the conflict between multinational corporations and their desire to gobble up everything, and as you said, I think it's 71% of the remaining untouched land pretty much controlled by indigenous peoples. Yeah. How can we prevent what seems like an endless stream of progress to gobble up all those things?
Well, let's define the word progress. To me, it merely means making complicated what is already simple. And I think we tend to be too full of ourselves as far as what intelligence is, and we tend to, because we don't have the happiness that those indigenous peoples have, but we tend to view our happiness as what we own and how much put in possession we have in our garage or whatnot, in our bank account. So we tend to make all our judgments through the bank, our decisions through the bank, rather than what those indigenous peoples are making their decisions through is Mother Earth. And treating Mother like she is a live being And yet we know, as all of us living now, we feel indigenous, but we have forgotten how. And so those indigenous peoples have not. And as Americans, and I see this, and I can spread this around and say it's a general statement too, but Americans don't want to admit they're wrong, because that means they're lower than. Americans also don't want to admit that they are unhappy, because it's the pride within, coming from maybe a peoples in Europe before that had all that taken away from them. So they came here to own property, to have this, not saying that you're outstanding. And then the religions dictate that the more you own, the more nicer things you have, then you must be a better person. And besides, God's going to look at you and give you these things. And then you're going to go to a place up there with pearly gates and streets paved with gold. Now, what thinking native person would want to go to some place that has pearly gates and streets paved with gold? Not one native person who knows themselves would ever want to go there.
Where do they go instead? I mean, what is the basis of the spirituality
as
you're talking
a
about?
Lakota, we have no need for a heaven. We have no need for a hell. It's right here. We're not worried about not going to heaven. We're not worried about going to hell. We are right here. We are conscious. There is no there's no past. There is no future. It's all right here, right now. We are both of those right now. So that we evolved into this state of consciousness that says, I am you, you are me. My body is in the soul, you are my soul. I must respect you. Instead of my soul is only in my body separate, so I must gather in order to feel like I own or I am somebody, because it's about individuality.
Now, understand, of course, Tiokasin, as I'm sure you do, that many people in our culture would say, well, what's wrong with the pearly gates and the streets paved with gold? Yeah. I mean, that's what we've been searching for our whole lives, and is to make more all the time.
And that's their story. Ours is that maybe we don't need, maybe we just, we turn into a tree. Maybe we turn into one of them. Maybe we turn into something. But energy is exchanged. We just don't die. Our spirit, our energy just goes back to earth, and that's a good thing too. But it's also that you live in Lakota philosophy. We were alive before we came here. We're alive now, and we'll be alive, even though physically we may change, because all of our reality in this way of thinking in rational thinking is contained within our physicality. We only understand our five senses and try to interpret what spirit is through religion and politics and rational thinking. So we're coming from a lack of mentality already. So we complain about everything. We complain about somebody who may know the answer as compared to somebody who is living the answer. We don't have words like believe, which is so easily used in this society, because believe to us, if you think about it, it's a spiritual lazy word, because that book says somebody else's experience is not your experience. That's believable? No, you have to know. Your experience says that you know this, and that's what you become wise, because in Lakota we had this saying, in order to protect ourselves, and it goes like this, that be careful of the education that they bring to you and force upon you, because that education may educate the wisdom out of your soul.
Interestingly, I'd hate to do this full circle thing, but obviously we'll talk about a lot of issues today and go for another couple of days. But as for today, when it comes to the holidays that are coming up, I know that those are of great importance to you, and in fact the radio show, I think you've said, will be, what, 4 hours long on Columbus Day, and then for a full day on Thanksgiving Day. One of the books that I read by, I think it was Francis Jennings, it talks about, actually the title is The Invasion of America. And obviously that would be, I think, a Lakota worldview. That's what happened when the Euro-Americans came here in their ships. Whereas our view, and the one that we have been taught up until very recently in elementary schools, is it was the discovery of America. Columbus discovered America and brought forth all the riches that Europeans could lavish upon this poor land. Right? How are those two different, and why do you view it as the invasion of America?
Well, it was the first World War to us. It was the first time we had contact, and they had money in their eyes, or that value that was new to us, because we gave all the time. Our number one value is generosity. And so they came and they took advantage of that generosity with greed. And when you come from a land that's divided up among kingdoms and serfdoms and whatnot, and you don't have, you're going to always want. And that's what it is. And in our culture, we don't have the word for want. So we don't need it. If you're in a sharing culture, you don't have the word for want. You always like, what can I give? So, and not rather than what I can have or take. So that's, you say we don't need a word for ownership. So when Columbus discovered, we actually had the view from the shore. That they came here, we saw them, and we saw that they were poor of spirit. We helped. And this is the stories of Taino who are still alive, the Arawak who are still alive, that the history books say are dead and gone. These people are speaking Taino in New York City. And they may be multiracial, but they are still speaking that language, and their stories are passed on. So when the onslaught of discovery came to us, people forget that Europe's Renaissance was based on the resources and the gold they took from here. And so when you have a people who are lacking in kingdom and serfdoms, and now all of a sudden they have, they're going to hold that above everybody else and say, look, we're not poor anymore, we're somebody now because we have material, just like that king who ruled us. So therefore the domination, dominate, which is a Latin word which comes, it really describes domo. Domo has 7 meanings, and that's where freedom comes from. So we don't say freedom, we say free. So when we're thinking about Columbus and a mentality, it's like a virus. And we have to protect ourselves from thinking and being with the virus by ownership, by war, which we don't have in our language. Now, all the stories that are made up about Indians only started when Columbus got here, and he supposedly named us Indians, but I don't think so. But the history of Indians only started with the history of this country, because before that, no one wants to talk about that. We are older than America, and there was another way of thinking here that still lies here and still here. And people don't want to talk about that because it's a new and better way, which for us as Native people, as evidenced, we are not in a better way or better state. We are in, actually, if we compare it, in a worse state. But spiritually, we are in a better, in a strong state, because we are resilient. We aren't resistant to what they are calling themselves as the power, because it's ruled by greed and war. It's a very much thing.
Obviously, I think what enters into this discussion a lot from the standpoint of Euro-Americans is that, hey, well, what about progress? I mean, haven't we done so much to this country that we know was never even possible before when the Indians, you know, ruled the 50 states? You know, I mean, now we have paved roads, and we have huge and impressive buildings, and we have statues, and we have all of the things that make life good.
Well, yeah. The roads, millions of, the biggest oil spill in the world happened in America. It's on roads and pavement and everything. That's the biggest oil spill. Look what it's doing to the land. People think because it's inanimate and it's not moving anywhere, that those so-called dinosaurs aren't going to, you know, get back at us. Well, look what's happening. The land's getting worse. In my time, coming from having no running water, clean water, having no
just
electricity.
Not
Yeah, just not running.
Right.
You know, having clean water, having clean air, having clean gardens that long before it was organic, growing up in a clean way, and giving thanks for everything all the time. To saying, well, you can't live that way, you have to live in cluster housing, and we'll provide running water for you. But then, because they took the land away, or we removed from those places that we lived, they took over, and they mined and they polluted the water that we were getting in those running water taps. So I don't know if it's a better way. I don't know if to say that, is it a better way to go bomb other people because they threaten you? So you have the atomic bombs going on, that mentality that we've all been living with now, whether or not we're going to exterminate ourselves. I don't think it's going to be by the bomb. I think it's because we don't know how to treat Earth anymore. That's the ultimate. We're not ever going to save ourselves, because salvation point mentality says it's got to come from someplace out there and not within. So we can't have a savior or a UFO coming down to save us at the last minute, because that's not going to happen, because that implies that there will only be a chosen one, which cannot be either within Lakota philosophy, that because we are responsible for each other.
part of the Euro-American myth is based on the fact that they had two things to enable them to control the native population. First of all, they had better armaments, weaponry, and whatnot that you had no access to. And secondly, they had the power of the word. It was that propaganda message that they were able to put out there, whether it was calling themselves civilized and your people barbarians or savages or heathens or whatever it happens to be. How was it that you have been able to maintain your language despite their efforts to indoctrinate you into the dominant culture, and yet it seems like they still control the words, whether it's this indigenous culture or indigenous cultures around the world?
About 3 years ago, I was interviewing some Brazilian indigenous peoples who came and had the regalia, and after the radio program, I took them to Wall Street, and we stood under George Washington, and they were speaking their language through Portuguese, who were interpreted into English so I could understand.
Right.
And I asked them the question, so what do you think about all this? You know, most people think that this is civilization, this is it, this is where man's gonna, you know, we should be thinking like Americans. And they had to interpret it, they thought about it for a while, and they put their hands out and they felt the ground and the earth, you know, some science fiction thing, really. And they were doing this, and they stopped and they talked to each other, and then one came forward and he said in my name, and then he spoke in his language, which he said, it's all temporary. This is all temporary. It's only going to be here for a few more years, and it's all going to go, because our mother is going to correct it. So that's metaphorically, it's not going to be here. Because if I say, okay, if I can be comparative in cultures, I am in a society of Mickey Mouse and McDonald's, and that's not a culture compared to Lakota. When we've been here before 10,000, before 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 years ago. We have stories and songs that we still sing to this day in our ceremonies about the Unkche, the dinosaurs, living with them. That's how old we say we are, not according to somebody else. We didn't come from the monkeys because that's somebody else's theory. We didn't come from the Bering Strait because that's their theory. They won't listen to our story where we had all land in the world on Mother Earth in one place, and we didn't behave amongst each other, and so she split us up. They won't believe that because there's no proof. So this is what we say. We have to tell the truth. We can't speak with forked tongue.
No forked tongue.
Right?
But at some point, there was an arrival here
Yes.
by the Lakota people, according to your tradition, correct? I mean, so do you envision that, I mean, along the lines of some whacked out religion where it was spaceships that landed here and suddenly took up residence, or is the tradition based on something more, I guess, believable?
We have, in the original creation story, life, this planet, stars, was created by thought. But then we say, what was thought created for? Where was that coming from? Well, there was always thought. We can't understand it in our little brains where thought came from, but we know that thought created Earth, thought created journey, thought created where we came from, in our sense, Diomene. And in the New Agers or whoever, scientists, astronomers, they say Pleiades, that constellation. We have that story. We came down here and we helped create Mother Earth. We had to respect and sort of make a Mother Earth. And so all of us peoples had that same way of thinking, your people, my people, as indigenous. And I'm going to get off track a little bit here, but you can correct me.
I don't think we've stayed on a track today.
No, okay,
Tiokasin, so that's fine.
That's good. But indigenous really means, in the etymology of Latin, means the poor people over there. So it's still describing us as those Indians on that reservation. But anyway, back to the creation story, that we were created by our thoughts and not just humans, because we view life as nations. There is the ant nation, there's the flying nation. There are all these nations, the water nation, the swimming nations. These are nations. And you think about that, they really are. They have guided their own original instructions. We're the only species on Earth that have not followed our original instructions to take care of each other and the Earth. We have gone outside and made ourselves disconnected from its process, its natural processes. So we aren't thinking naturally anymore like we could be. We tend to make a park over here, and that's not natural process thinking. That's rational thinking. We're gonna, these few blocks are a park, and we can go and play there because it's accessible. But when you come to a reservation, we don't have parks. Because
it is the park.
It is.
Right.
It is the park. Our reservation is reserved for, and it's interesting too, Native people only have the right to occupy where we live. And that's it. We really think about it. We really can't own land. And so the United States understood that. It's maybe the only minority in the United States that cannot legally own land. We have a right to occupy and hold a piece of paper saying, my family was given that in 1880 when the Dawes Act said, oh, we'll give the parcels of land, 160 acres or so, to each family or head of family. And you can live on that, but you cannot own that. Earlier
you mentioned the quote-unquote father of our country, George Washington, and I guess a statue somewhere on Wall Street. I guess I had read some positive things about him in terms of what he had to say about Native Americans way back when. Specifically, my understanding is that the first Thanksgiving, according to some traditions, came because the Pequots in Connecticut were a slightly more warlike nation than the Wampanoags in Massachusetts, and so the Pilgrims were doing well with the Wampanoags, sharing with them and whatnot, but the Pequots wanted to fight. And then there was a large massacre of Pequot women and children, and then there continued to be massacres. The first massacre, the Pilgrims said, that's a great day of Thanksgiving. And then they had another massacre, and they said, and this is another day of Thanksgiving. And my understanding is George Washington said, well, let's stop with the Thanksgivings. Let's just have one. So I guess to try and put an end to the massacres, is that, what is your understanding of George Washington and some of the founding fathers in terms of their viewpoints toward Indians?
Well, yeah, sort of alluded to it last a few minutes ago, where I did talk about the founding fathers is, and I live in the state of South Dakota, right? And I grew up there.
Yep.
And I see Mount Rushmore. The four founding fathers, one of them anyway.
Right. Yep.
Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, and what's the other one? Roosevelt,
right.
Modern day founding father.
Right.
Well, each of them we can name, we teach our children. It's like, okay, George Washington, he's the village burner. He ordered his army, Continental Congress Army, to go and kill every Indian that has a village up and along the Missouri or the Mohawk River, and in the state of New York in this area, any native. And you put a bounty out on them, and you give them, the males the bigger bounty, and if you get them, bring the skins here. And we go on and on and on. Jefferson also called hunt them down like the wolf. He excluded Native people as he was writing, stealing the words from the Iroquois people. Teddy Roosevelt nationalized over 52 million acres to make national parks, and he took those away from reservations in the early part of the 1900s. Who's left? Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The same day he signed this country's largest mass execution of 38 Dakota men for supposedly stealing a cow that wandered onto their given reservation boundaries. And then the Dakota said, oh, we're sorry, we didn't know, it didn't have a brand, and we thought it was on our own, we were hungry, we were starving at the time. So the Native people gathered about 40 other skinny cattle as well, and gave it to the one farmer. That one farmer wanted justice. He says, I want the man, I don't want the cows. So all of them said, I am guilty. So the army came down, and that's when that sort of war came along. And in the end, over 500 were indicted. So Lincoln signed, well, let's only hang 38 of them. They all hung at the same time in Mankato, Minnesota. So these are, the ideas that people are holding up as, well, forget about what we did to the Indians or the Native people. Let's hold what this freedom and caring for loving our fellow men is based upon. But let's not talk about the tree roots people. Let's talk about what we can change as far as grassroots movements is concerned. We're not concerned about having the graveyard still under the U.S. Capitol building with the Lenape bones, the graveyard still on that hill of where the U.S. Capitol building. Let's not talk about that.
This was a burial mound sacred
to
the Indians.
It's still there. It's proven. It's still there. So people want proof. Anything I say can be picked up in a book.
We're beginning to run short of time, so I guess you know, I feel that we can learn a lot from your culture, and I mean, just myself, I guess from the personal standpoint, one of the reasons that I moved into quote unquote farming country was like I wanted to bring my children back into contact with the earth and living things around them, and to tell you the truth, I've been an abject failure because they want to maintain that connection to the culture, you know, whether it's iPods or TV sets or video games or whatever it happens to be. I have the hardest time just getting them outside. I mean, is there a way that we can make this as accessible as it seems to be, you know, as part of our conversation, the whole relational notion that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves?
You know, it all through the program, people would probably view this, oh, that's another one of those angry Indians, right? And we disagree with him. But the thing is, see, that to know technology as we are using it, we're using it in a proper manner, because it's spoiling us. So what do? We don't cut back on it. We view it differently. One thing that can change, I can give you all the information, but if I change your heart, I can have influence and change. But if I give you information, no one's going to change, because that's what I can and cannot have and have nots. So when you come to the children, when you view technology, I was taught to view this light here, this television, this thing, these microphones, as having magic in them, and that any time the creator can take that magic away because you're misusing it. So we base this society, this culture, on a light switch. You turn it off, whatever people think is culture is not going to work anymore. What do you have left? You have Earth. And guess who's still trying to live with Earth? Is those indigenous peoples all over the world, including the peoples that you come from. The farmers in Kansas, they understand a lot more than those of us, those people who grew up only among humans and having domesticated animals, right, in the city. In fact, there was a report a few months ago that there are more domesticated animals in the United States now than there are wild animals. So, you know, we have to start looking at those things that you and I probably never thought would ever happen because of our privilege as Americans. So,
as the indigenous cultures become extinct, so become many of the species on Earth, correct? I mean, there is that connection between those two things. Just as sort of a parting thought, I know you've talked about these stones, and I think I might have mentioned to you that Crazy Horse is alleged to have said to his people when he knew that he would be taking part in his last battle, I will return to you as a black stone. Can you connect us in some way to those stones in Brazil, I think you may have said, or South America, Central America?
Well, the stones in Central America, and I'm not too sure which country, maybe Belize in that area, but there are these valleys, or this area where there are mass round circular stones. In the 80s, I think it was, where this engineer who studied sonar, sound waves, and was among these people, and he would go because he thought to find out more about ethnography, the study of music.
Right. Yep.
He went to find out why these primitive people were doing these things that were amazing to him, like sitting and listening for hours from sun up to sundown without saying words, perfectly still in a meditative trance-like state. Because one young virgin would go hit a standing stone that was a pillar, and she would hit, and he would sit down and they would listen. But this man who was in Western science, who thought he knew everything, whatnot, that he could not hear the sound. Next year he came back with all the equipment, all these microphones, and he was able to record what that little girl was hitting. And it became a song. And that's a song that they told him that they were singing, and he could hear it. And I won't mention, but there's a lot of modern day movies that are based on a lot of indigenous thinking processes. And see, to us, it's not, we told you so, or give us credit for it.
Right.
Because we realize that because Americans are eating our ancestors and have been for centuries, this land has the food of our DNA of our ancestors, that the rest of America will finally get it, if not in this generation, the you and I will see it.
Hopefully, all of us will begin to hear that same sound.
Yeah.
And Tiokasin, I thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
And one more version of MSL's Educational Forum.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much. Thank you for being with us today.